Hey, part two. Part two of the twin flame journey, empath. This is literally going to explain all of your relationships. Narcissism, karmic relationships, soulmates, all of it. If you guys saw at the last part, I left off with how an empath is created. In our society, we've all been taught that we need someone to complete us. So that's why all of us, we've learned by societal conditioning that we need to look for another person. It's actually a reflection of the fact that we haven't created a relationship with ourselves. We haven't chosen ourselves and dated ourselves and got to really get in alignment with who we are. Very first off, from the beginning, a narcissistic parent will get into a relationship thinking that, again, no fault of their own, but from conditioning from their family and from society, is that they need a person to complete them. We're all taught this same dynamic. We get married, we date, we look for another person, we get married, and then we have kids, we get a house, all that stuff. You know, all of these really old conditioning patterns that have been chemically programmed into us from the very first place, all based around the low vibrational emotions of shame, guilt, and fear. A narcissistic parent, they're not in alignment with themselves. They have all these fears, shame, guilt, and fear of rejection, fear of abandonment. So they get into a relationship with another narcissistic person, right? Two incomplete people that have not found themselves and gotten in touch with themselves and gotten into alignment with who they truly are. There's usually a person in the relationship that's going to be more needing their emotions, like they're needing communication, they're needing this, they're needing that, and then there'll usually be another person that's more detached. They aren't really as emotionally available, they might be a little bit more neglectful. When this person that needs communication and their emotional needs met by another person, when these two come into relationship with each other, obviously the person that's needing all these emotional needs from another person and not getting it from themselves, they're expecting another person to act or behave a certain way to complete them, to make them feel whole. This parent will start wanting to have children. That's kind of a natural response. A narcissistic parent will kind of have more of a drive to have children. They are wanting to fill that need within themselves. When a narcissistic parent has a baby, there's this phase of infancy where obviously the infant completely relies on the narcissistic parent. So it fulfills all of the narcissist's needs. They are like, oh, someone needs me. And they feel complete. It really fulfills, because temporarily they're getting their fix. They're getting everything that they need. Someone is needing them and relying on them, so it releases all of these dopamine chemicals. But what will happen is the narcissistic parent, that's only for a certain phase of time. We get older, and as children, when a child is feeling all of this burden of the narcissistic parent's wants and needs and expectations, and feeling all this shame, guilt, and fear, they're naturally going to want to detach. They will want to go out on their own and be independent. So this is why every single child, they go through this phase where they want to go out and be independent. This is when they start creating an ego, which ironically is a complete reflection of the narcissistic parent. They've taken on all the same exact brain chemical releases, all of the same exact thought patterns. So when a child is growing up, this is why they start to say no. This is why they start to disobey or do whatever they want or become selfish, because they're learning that they have to be, because there's all these expectations on them. The narcissistic parent, now every family dynamic is going to vary with this. There can be multiple children. It all depends on the amount of shame, guilt, and fear stored within the parents, and all of that, all of it is going to be completely depending on everything. Environmental factors, how many siblings, how much trauma has been through the ancestral line and passed down, all these thought patterns and beliefs, how much chemical releases are behind each one of them. So all of that is going to play into effect. So obviously, I'm going to try to give a general, and it should more than likely apply to your family situation, but just take it kind of as a generalization and keep it kind of broad so you can try to apply it to your own family. The narcissistic parent, if they continue to have children, then they will want to keep filling that need, because the first child they have, it will grow up and then they don't need them as much anymore. So the parent kind of wants that dopamine release again. They want to feel needed again. So they'll usually have multiple children. They continue to do this. So this is where the empath falls in. When the narcissistic parent has a very specific brain chemical release, thought patterns, this will create an empath. Genetically, DNA-wise, everything. It will usually come at the time that the narcissistic parent thinks that this is their very last child. This is the very last kid that they're going to have. Because when they feel like, oh my gosh, I'm not going to have any more children, and chemically it's going to create an empath. Because since the parent realizes that this is their very last child, this is their very last infant, this is their baby, this will create an empath genetically and everything. So the narcissistic parent, what they'll kind of do unconsciously is the children will see the empath or the scapegoat as the spoiled one in the family. All of the spoiling is actually all of these manipulation tactics. It's all of this shame, guilt, and fear that's being projected at this empath or scapegoat in the family, because the narcissistic parent doesn't want to be abandoned. They have this huge fear of rejection and abandonment because that's their baby. That's their last one. That's the last one that needed them. So unconsciously, they actually create that empath or the baby of the family, or wherever you fall in line. It doesn't matter the placement. It usually comes at the time that the narcissistic parent thinks that this is the last child, so it can create an empath. The empath is taught by the narcissistic parent to only care with their observation about the narcissistic parent's needs. So this is how an empath gets created, is they only care about the wants, needs, and emotions of the narcissistic parent, and it makes them completely neglect and abandon their own needs. This is a huge blessing in disguise. It's a curse and a gift. It can turn into a gift. An empath will take on every single part of the narcissistic parent. Every shame, guilt, and fear, everything. And the interesting thing is, while they are empathic, this line gets very blurred between empath and bully within an empath. So in times or in specific places in their life, they can be a bully and project their own shame, guilt, and fear, because those are all brain chemicals stored in the cells. This is a scientific thing. This is not just spiritual. So an empath actually ends up being pretty narcissistic without knowing it. So they have a huge problem with boundaries, with trust and intimacy in relationships. It's a reflection of the fact that they have learned to abandon themselves. They have fears of rejection, fear of abandonment, because they also have been taught to reject themselves and their own wants and needs and emotions and put other people's needs in front of their own. This is a programming that's been taught to an empath. Everyone has this ability, though. That's one thing I want you to understand, too, is when it comes to this whole narcissistic family dynamic and scapegoats and golden children, the whole golden child thing and scapegoat thing, it gets passed around from child to child in the family. And it kind of goes through this rotation. One child will be a scapegoat, and then over a period of time, what the pattern that happens, the empath, since they're already programmed with this fear of rejection, fear of abandonment, they will eventually reject and abandon the narcissistic parent. Because that's the programming, that's the cycle and pattern that goes on in the family. Eventually they will. This usually happens around teenage years because the emotions are getting stored up so quickly that, especially during puberty and all of that, things that we perceive as puberty, it's really just kind of like a buildup of all the chemicals going on within the body and all the development that's gone on. Eventually the empath child, is going to abandon the narcissistic parent. So that's usually why there's this really big traumatic split in the family between the kids and the parents, is because it's just a complete reflection of the fear of rejection and fear of abandonment that's been passed along the whole family line. Once the scapegoat rejects and abandons the narcissistic parent, then unconsciously they actually become a little bit of a bully in certain aspects in their life. And again, this can vary in very different ways. So for example, in personal relationships, the empath might be a bit of a pushover. They get walked all over because the personal relationships that we have are usually the reflections of our parents and our siblings that we grew up with, those low vibrational brain chemical releases, and we're probably going to have more of a vulnerability in those personal relationships, right? Because those people see who we really are. They see under the grandiose image or the mask that we put on to cover up our shame, guilt, and fear. We might go out into different areas and relationships in our life, and we could be a bully. You might go to work, and in your personal relationships, you might be extremely vulnerable and passive and really sensitive and sweet. But at work, you're a complete asshole or a bitch. It's because it's showing you the complete different aspects of yourself. It's showing you the split aspects of yourself. And it's actually showing you the dynamics that you grew up with. You might have one part of you that is a scapegoat or an empath. You also took on that bullying aspect from your parents, right? Because it's a programming that we've all kind of taken on at some level or some degree. When the empath abandons the narcissistic parent, then the narcissistic parent needs their needs filled by someone else because they just lost their baby. They lost their empath who was completely focused on their needs and their wants and was having all these brain chemical releases. They'd have all this programming. So what the narcissist will do, since there's this huge separation, the narcissist will end up turning to another child if there's another child in the family. If there's not, if it's a lonely child, then honestly, I don't know if there's much of an escape. They probably will eventually abandon the parents, but it takes a while because it's going to take a while to really separate from all of that shame, guilt, and fear of rejection, fear of abandonment that's being projected at them. Once the narcissistic parent has been abandoned by the empath, then they will end up usually turning to another child if there's other children in the family. So this is where the dynamic kind of continues on. Someone who might have been considered a golden child or a bully in the family or favored or whatever, everyone kind of has all these messed up perceptions of one another, then the dynamic will completely switch. Another kid in the family might completely turn from being the golden child or the bully to being the scapegoat and being the empath. This will chemically happen. This is the dynamic that all of us go through as relationships because we're all narcissistic to some degree. Only meaning that we have some level or degree of shame, guilt, and fear. And you can Google that if you want. You can totally look it up. This is the whole pattern and foundation of soulmate, karmic relationships, and twin flames. I'm going to end this part as part 2. Jump over to part 3. This is where I'm going to explain how this completely ties in to the whole soulmate, karmic relationships, and especially the twin flames, because this is going to make so much sense. When I realized all of this, I was like, dude, yes, this makes complete sense. So jump over to part 3. This is where I'm going to finish up this whole description, okay? Thank you guys so much, and I'll see you over in the next video.